What up, YouTube? Here we are again and talking today about slavery and some more reasons of why I'm an atheist. And we're going to talk about biblical slavery today versus the slavery of the American history versus American slavery. And we're going to go into these topics and we will see where we go from here. So I'm going to talk, you're going to listen. If we get engagement on this, that'd be great. But if not, that's fine. And just upload it and see how it goes. So, first off, let's talk about, the Bible is full of references to slavery. Like, just chock full of it. The Jews themselves were actually often taking of slaves and were able to buy slaves from other people and were able to own slaves. The slavery was not something that they were allowed to do in the Bible. It was something that they were allowed to do, and there's books of the Bible that even outline or tell the Jews and the people that listen to that how to own slaves and how to take care of the slaves and treatment of slaves, including punishments for those things you do to slaves that are harmful, but also certain loopholes that you could get around that, if there was a perfect or moral perfection, we would not consider this to be it as someone who lives in America, someone who believes in the institution of freedom and the ability to say what you like and then make videos like this and things like that. So let's talk more about this. So the Bible references slavery a lot. The key references of slavery in the Bible are probably in Exodus chapter 20 and then also Numbers 31. And this is the kind of point that was brought up, which caused me to talk about this, is Numbers 31, 9 through 20. And I'm not going to read it for you, but basically Moses sent the Israeli army out against the Midianites, and he wanted to destroy all of them, and as God had commanded them to own the land of Canaan, and just fight in general, because Moses and God were always up for a fight. So Moses sent the Israel army into the land of the Midianites. They killed everyone except for the women who had not known man, the young virgin girls. Now that's pretty unique and pretty ironic that out of everybody else, they killed the men, the women that had known a man, and they killed all these people, but they were allowed to keep the virgin girls for themselves. It specifically says that they were allowed to keep the virgins for themselves, and which is obviously not a good case, and so. The point that I heard the apologists make was simply to the point that the other cultures, the other nations that were surrounding Israel were unclean. They were horrible, wicked people, which of course there's no real evidence that demonstrates this one way or the other. We just have to go on what the Bible says, for the Bible tells me so. As like listen to that little jingle there. For the Bible tells me so. Just kidding. But they were allowed to take the virgins for themselves, and it's pretty messed up. Like not even when we conquer other lands and things like that. We didn't really that's as America and other nations conquer. Like a lot of times they leave. They very rarely had the choice just to leave the virgin girls for themselves. And the funny part, or the ironic part, that through a lot of the slavery mentions in the Bible and a lot of the times that you're as you're reading through the Bible, you hear about the Jews being put into slavery. So God's punishment for his people disobeying his word in the Bible, or disobeying his prophets, or whatever have you, was to put the people into slavery. So the punishment that God meted out was to put them into slavery. Like, that's the punishment they receive for disobeying the man of the hour, the man of God. So, of all people, usually, and you read into the Bible, as you read about them being slaves, becoming slaves, Daniel in the lion's den and other, slaves, famous slaves of the Bible, like, it's ironic, right, that this is their punishment, this slavery. And I think often about women being sold into slavery, and I don't know what else you'd call it, a contract, a marriage contract. Maybe it was more important than that. Maybe I I don't understand it as well as I should, which, I'll take that. But the name of the channel is Armchair Philosophy, so get over it. The women were sometimes sold into slavery too. There's the story of the little slave who, the Jewish slave, I believe, who saved, the guy who went and dipped in the river 7 times. I forgot his name. I can't remember anymore. But also, I was thinking more along the lines of even the patriarchy. Jacob went to work for Laban, and he worked for 7 years for Rachel, which is who he wanted, and he got so drunk on the night of the wedding. So the 7-year mark, right? He's out there and he's doing his thing, and he gets so drunk that he does not realize in the morning until he wakes up and is hungover or whatever that the woman in bed with him was not Rachel, but was in fact Leah, the older sister, who gave him a lot more children. But that's how you measured the value of a woman back then, is how many children they could bear for you. Doesn't really matter anything else. And then he had to work for another 7 years to get Rachel. And 14 years of work for a guy to get women. And the Bible does not mention anything about whether these women were okay with this prospect or what they, if they said no or anything. I assume that they were talking during this time. Like, of course, the Bible paintings that you see of Jacob, Rachel, and Leah always are dignified and things like that. But, in honesty here, these women were sold to Jacob for the price of 7 years of labor. They were basically sold into slavery. Now, I doubt that Jacob treated them that way as slaves, but if you think about the prospect of what women were back then, it's not too far out of the realm. Another one I think that was really popular of women being sold into slavery was Esther, right? She didn't have a choice, line up all the women, and I'm going to choose the one that looks the hottest. It's a pretty messed up story, right? Obviously, but it was like, oh, well, that's not the Jews, but yeah, still, women were often just objects to be bought and sold in the Bible. And so most of them, the Bible doesn't really mention that they had a choice to do anything except for what they were told to do. It doesn't mention if they had the option to say no, or if that was even explored, or if, anything. And by and large, we can pretty much say that they didn't. An arranged marriage back then was pretty popular, and it not as much in today's day and age, but I know in India and other parts of the world, sometimes even that arranged marriage is still somewhat of a thing, and that's basically selling your children into a form of slavery, being stuck to someone that they don't necessarily love, to live the rest of their life with, because of course divorce is the worst possible thing that you can do. So I say most of that to say this is the main point I want to drive here, is that as an American, I look back at the history and the whitewashing of our history and things like that, and how we always talk about racism in America, things like that. And we bring up the subject of slavery gets brought up eventually when you're talking about the racism topics, or if you're talking about racially charged topics. And as an American, unfortunately, I have to own this fact. Now, when it comes to my heritage and ancestry, as I have been told, my heritage and ancestry are of immigrants, and they were not in America even during the American Civil War. But that doesn't excuse me from the fact that as what I would be considered to be a white American, and I'm not ashamed of that, but it is what it is. I have to own that the slavery happened in America, and we did that. It's something that I can't hide from history. I can't say, no, this didn't happen. No, this is not the way it went down. But you can't own it. Biblical slavery, and this is the main point which I wish apologists would get to, is I wish that you could own biblical slavery and stop denying that it happened. That's the main thing. Like, you gotta stop denying that slavery occurred in the Bible. It absolutely did. Sometimes the Jews were the subject of that slavery. Sometimes the Jews were on the opposite end and were the ones owning of slaves. And you gotta own it. But herein lies the problem. Herein lies the problem with that, and I understand the reason why you can't, is because of American morality. Your belief that slavery is wrong because you're an American. I'm speaking mainly to folks in America here, but other places as well can fall to this. Christians in other lands that do celebrate freedom. You can kind of agree with this, that American morality, like the world's morality nowadays, pretty much views slavery as a bad thing. Most of the countries of the free world view slavery as bad. And a belief in an all-loving God that writes that morality in our hearts, right? Because he's the one that we're supposed to be judging and basing our morality by. That conflicts with the culture of the Bible, that conflicts with the writing in the Bible, where you view slavery as, you know, the morality of our culture, where we view slavery as a bad thing. It conflicts with that because the Bible never openly rejected the institution of slavery. It never explicitly said that slavery was a bad thing. In the Bible, it does not say that. And you're like, well, that was a different time, different culture. Like they were saving these people from themselves. Basically, they were horrible people that were getting sick, and because of Jewish practices of cleaning things and sanctifying things, they were ahead of their time, and they maybe prevented diseases and illnesses that would have gotten in, and they tried to keep it between one man and one woman, which again is bullshit because of the kings of Israel. We know most of them have multiple wives, David and Solomon being the best examples, of course, of that. So bullshit for one thing. But that conflicts with an all-loving God. And even today, between the period of 1865, which is when the Civil War ended, even to around the 1965 or 1960s, which was when the Civil Rights Movement was kind of kicking off with Martin Luther King Jr. and others, Malcolm X and others that I don't sadly know as much as I would like to about the history of that particular time frame. But even then, even when slavery was abolished, we made laws and things that heavily were stacked against, at the time, African Americans. I'd call them black people today. Just, it's the color of their skin. They call me white people, or white man. Like, that's not anything racially charged about. It's just the color of my skin. Like, I don't worry about it. But the black people of today are not really, they're not slaves. Like, it's already been multiple generations, right? It's been 100 years, almost 175, 130 years since the Civil War ended. So I don't think I owe them anything, and I don't think they owe me anything. But the laws of the land in America, up until, and even now today, but it's getting somewhat better. Some regulations are going in to protect people, but even now, like, it's heavily stacked against them. So they were granted a freedom, an intellectual freedom in 1865, but were they honestly free to pursue the American dream the way that most white people are able to pursue it? And that American dream being to own land, a house, have a wife, kids, boy and a girl, dog, cat, 2 cars, whatever, that kind of American dream. And we didn't really allow them to have that freedom because, they didn't have anything, people wouldn't hire them. They had nowhere to go. Like, where are they going to go? We set them free, but we didn't have houses or things for them to live in. So it was kind of a messed up thing. Even when we freed them, we did not truly free them in giving them the same rights that we had. And I think even voting laws and things like that were even crazier. But going back to now, the inference of an all-loving God and the conflict that we have with the Bible of an all-loving God, our American morality, and biblical slavery, all those things are in conflict. And if God's the one that's writing in the heart, the inference is that God is all loving, right? I hear that a lot. That God is all loving, all powerful, omniscient, all present, omnipresent, all the omnis that you can pack into the thing. That the God of the Bible is an all powerful thing, of which we get, I guess, the all powerful from Genesis and from where He creates the world, that kind of stuff. We get the all present because He expanded the space, like if you believe the biblical account, like He created the world from nothing, which again is magic. He created man from dust, which is what most atheists believe in a certain way, that most people, life on earth had a common ancestor. So it's still a similar thing. It's just that you believe God did it, and I believe, I don't know what did it, but what catalyst it happened, but it happened over the period of time. And basically the inference for an all-loving God comes from John 3:16, right? If God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life, right? That's the the inference of an all-loving God, because if he loves you as much, he'll save you from himself, from rules he created for himself, and then had to sacrifice himself to appease himself for things that he had created. So the morals God wrote on our heart conflict with the biblical laws talked about in the treatment of slaves. Now, I hear you're about to come at me with the year of Jubilee and talk about, some of those Levitical laws about the year of Jubilee, where every 7 years, people basically were freed. But that only applies to Hebrew slaves. You were allowed to own non-Hebrew slaves basically until they die, like they are your property. And I think it was like 3 or 4 generations. I don't remember off the top of my head. I apologize about that. But basically, for the slaves to become clean, they had to circumcise, and then they had to remain clean for 3 generations or something like that to join. Like if you wanted, as an outsider, there were specific ways that you could join the Jewish nation, one of which was circumcision, but you also had other rules that you had to follow. And even then, you were kind of like an outsider, so kind of like a person on a green card. And you weren't given citizenship into the Jewish kingdom until later. And I think it was like your grandkids, like you weren't even allowed to get citizenship. So it didn't apply to non-Jewish slaves. And the treatment of slaves in the Bible, the way that it's written, doesn't even prevent like harm in general, like as we would consider harm today to be emotional, physical harm, emotional or physical harm. It doesn't really prevent emotional harm at all. It doesn't mention that. Emotional harm is not mentioned. And the physical harm part is basically if you pluck out an eye or a tooth, then you have to pay the slave his fee and set him on his way. But it did not mention basically beating the man to a bloody pulp. If he's able to get up in about 3 days and walk again, you're fine. There's no laws broken. You're able to do what you want with your slave. So that's a pretty big loophole. You could beat the man to a quarter of his life as long as he did not pluck out his eye or beat his teeth in. As long as you didn't do those things, you could pretty much beat him to an inch of his life and be okay. And there's no treatment about words about emotional abuse. And we all know how that, is characterized these days and things of emotional abuse and the trauma of dealing with emotional problems. And that doesn't mention anything about that. Nothing. So you could call your slave a piece of crap. You could call him, you could, belittle them, whatever you wanted. And if you want to tell me that wasn't how people did that back then, you're absolutely wrong. You know that. We talk about, the Exodus. We talk about the treatment of slaves, the Jews as slaves in Egypt. And obviously, that's viewed as a cruel thing. Like the Egyptians were cruel to the Jews and made them, make mud for the pyramids without any straw and all sorts of, kind of tomfoolery that they did to the Jews, how horrible that they were to the Jews. And if you want to tell me that the Jews did not pay some of that back to the Egyptians when they left and or to slaves that they encountered and captured for themselves, I don't buy it. I don't believe you. Even if the adage is to treat others as you want to be treated, the biblical golden rule did not exist at that point. And that's one of the other problems with the Ten Commandments, that even though Jesus said the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He said a similarity of that, but basically something of that nature, which is considered the golden rule. It's not in the Ten Commandments. It's not really in the Old Testament to do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. So the conflict is that you believe God to be the source of our morality. You anchor God as a source of morality, but the conflict comes in when you cannot own slavery because that disagrees with the morality that we have in American culture that is written on our hearts due to the popularity of the culture. And the morality of a nation is ingrained into it by its culture. It is subject to change, and it is not an immutable or immutable rule, as we have discovered with the communism in Russia or Nazism in Germany. That morality that they practice obviously was horrible, killing millions of their own people. That's bad morality, but it's subject to change, And where was the morality written into their hearts that God had written? If God writes the morality on everybody's heart, how on earth can they possibly think that it's okay to do the things that they did? So they go against that moral code. And I guess you could say anybody goes against it, but still, God is the one that writes the laws. And if you're trying to base it in God's morality, then you believe that slavery is an okay thing. You cannot disagree with me. So as I was further talking about this and in developing this subject, I began to talk. This isn't a video I'm not going to post, but basically, I began to think about how I became kind of a slave and a modern slave to the church. I'm a very agreeable person. I like to please people. I'm what I would like to call a people pleaser. Although I am lazy and my bosses and things don't like that, and I wish I could fix that about myself and make myself not lazy. I know that the people pleaser is part of how you can become a hypnotized slave of the church. So even today, and this is worked into the psychology kind of the church, and the way that a lot of the churches are set up is to use low forms of hypnotism. So as a churchgoer, as a person that went to church for most of my life, basically about 32 years, I'm 36 now, for 32 years of life, and I went to church for most services, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, most of the time I was there. That kind of didn't, not as much when I grew past the college age. And even in college, I didn't go to Wednesday night church because I had to work. But I went to Sunday night and Sunday morning, Sunday night for sure, and lots of special meetings. And we had college, chapel every day. So we got preached at a lot. And there was, it wasn't every day. Either way, we got preached at a lot. So I've been to church, and the way the churches are set up, of course, they have the song service, and the song, of course, music is powerful. There's no denying that fact, and that music can put you, and music is able to put people into trance-like states. Of course, hypnotists use a certain type of music when they're trying. At our state fair every year, we had a hypnotist show, which was fun to watch. I did try it one year. I was partially hypnotized. I definitely was. And I woke up about halfway through the show, but just decided for the enjoyment of my friends, again, being a people pleaser, I didn't want to just show that I had, woken up. And so I just went along with the hypnotist for the rest of the show, even though I was wide awake and cognizant of what he was asking me to do. But the reason, as a Christian, that I felt so, happy at the end of every church service is because it's structured that way. It is deliberately designed to induce a hypnotic state. So starting with the song service and people singing, of course, when the pastors and things tell you to do things, asking you to stand and sit there, looking for your suggestibility level. So as a hypnotist also stands on stage and starts playing the music and is looking towards the audience to find his candidates for hypnotism, he's looking for people that are suggestible to what he's doing. If you're sitting in the show with crossed arms or in the bench with crossed arms, he knows you're not a suggestible candidate, and it will be harder for him to try and hypnotize you than it would be for someone who is listening to him and doing exactly what he says. So as the church service that I went to for many, many years was orchestrated, you basically start with a song service, which is lively, and as the songs progress, they become more and more melancholic. And then we sometimes would chant from the Bible, basically, where we would do kind of a chant reading, like you read the first verse, I read the second verse, and so on, and we would read verses and chants, basically, which is something the Catholic Church uses quite a bit. So again, another suggestibility piece being added there, listening, chanting and getting involvement in the service to help induce. And then finally, of course, the music closer to the preaching time was always the calmest, and then you would sit and listen to the pastor. And before you realize that you were open to the suggestion, and you kind of would fall into the state where you are sometimes just listening, and you're just kind of zoned out. And of course, you if you're open to suggestion, if you love to please people, then you're going to listen to what the pastor has to say. And and for most good pastors, I would say most of the time their stories are funny or engaging. They have funny anecdotes. They have funny stories to tell, or just powerful, sad stories. And I've mentioned this in some of my previous videos, but as humans, we love to hear stories. I even to this day, I love to hear a story. You could tell me a story about almost anything, and I would love to listen to it because I want to see how it ends, and I want to laugh, or I want to feel moved. I want to do something with a story. I like to feel emotion. We all do. But as the service draws to a close, so you've had this hypnotic suggestion all throughout. As the service draws to a close, the pastor starts speaking slower and slower, eventually getting to usually kind of a whisper where they're asking you to come forward. Like they'll get another again. The pianist will come back up. They usually play the same song. In our church, I believe it's just "As I Am," just as I am, without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for thee, and that thou bidst me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, I come. And I only know the first verse of that song, but we play "Just As I Am" at the end of every service, which is a very calm song, very, very sweet song. And the pastor would ask you to come forward and to pray and secure your decision that they had been pushing for with God. So just as hypnotists suggest things, the pastor had suggest things either to stop sinning in some way or to stop sinning of some type and things of that nature. And they would suggest those during the service, and the pastor would always ask at the end of the service to come forward and kneel and pray. And prayer is a form of meditation. If, as basic as it can get, and other religions practice meditation, and even there's use for meditation, I believe, even in non-religious senses, to help calm your body and to allow you to control your breathing, and can help put you in a relaxed state. So at the very end, you're asked to come pray. And the prayer, of course, is you talking to God. You go up front to the altar, is where you're supposed to go. You can do it at your church, at your bench, but you're not supposed to. You're supposed to go to the altar. You're supposed to bow on your knees, and you're supposed to pray. And as you pray, of course, you're letting these feelings go to God. So you're feeling this euphoria of obeying the suggestion of the pastor over a period of 20-30 minutes. So you're feeling this euphoria of this trance that you've been in, listening to his story, of course. And that's, again, if it's funny story, just like a comedy show, like I enjoy listening to stand-up comedy, just like a comedy show, of course I'm entertained, I'm happy at the end of the service. So, of course I'm happy at the end of the service. In most cases, in the ones that they hadn't actually put me to sleep, which did happen and does happen during church services, at least the ones I attend. But basically, I'm happy. I'm feeling euphoric. I'm like, oh man, and of course, part of talking to God, and as they talk about prayer and things like that, they talk about methodologies. Sorry, for prayer. They mentioned to always get right with God first. Before you ask, if my kid wants to ask me something, they should repair their relationship with me. And the same thing goes with God. Is kind of how they did it, because it's human nature, and we're supposed to be in the image of God. That's a topic for another time. But you would be in a euphoric state. And of course, you'd be happy on your way home. You'd be thinking about the things that you had committed to. And just as in the hypnotist show, going back to the state hypnotism show, just as in the hypnotist show, at the end of it, the hypnotist would always say, "You're going to leave here," and as he snapped him free of the hypnotism, he would basically say, "You're going to leave here feeling refreshed and feel like you've had a great night's sleep, and you're just going to have the most energy. You're just going to feel the best that you have." And it's proven that hypnosis does work with people, that you can temporarily get bonuses and boosts, which is why meditation isn't a bad thing to practice when you need a boost. When you taking a few 5-minute, 10-minute nap, even a power nap or something where you meditate, close your eyes, slow your breathing, calm down, you can get that boost and kind of hypnotize yourself. And you feel that as you leave the church, you feel this euphoric state of mind where you have become clean with God, and you now feel committed to the decision that you have made. But as always, with the hypnotism eventually wears off. It is not a permanent thing, so you cannot permanently stay hypnotized. So the next day after you actually have gone to sleep and woken up, you often forget everything that you have committed to. And even if you wrote it down, you're in that trance-like state, so you're not really paying attention. Your subconscious is being spoken to, and you don't recognize that you're being hypnotized. And this is, the greatest televangelist, and even Dr. Hiles himself was a master at this. This ability to control people on a subconscious level. And you would never think about going against the hypnotist because they control you on that level. So realizing this and realizing a connection here between hypnotism and the church and kind of how the church is structured, the church service, it's possible to believe that even the reason why so many people still believe and are stuck in the church and because of just habit and things is because they're a partially hypnotized slave of the church itself. They are hypnotized and love the euphoric feeling. And of course, that's the reason why you're going to come back, because that feeling at the end of the church service, when you've given yourself to God, when you feel that euphoria, when those endorphins are rushing into your body from the confession of your sins to Jesus and God, and as you feel that euphoria from doing so, you want more. The endorphins kick in. You want more and more and more. And that's why Christians, especially the newest Christians, are always so excited. They're so happy to be there because they don't really realize what's happening. And as with the older Christians, even that have been there a long time, of course, they get lulled into that sleep. And of course, they do feel good when they wake up because they've been to church. They've done what they're supposed to do. But are you a hypnotized slave of the church? So hypothetical question number one for you is, are you a hypnotized slave of the church? Do you even realize what is happening to you when you're in a church service? And it's not just church. I mean, this happens at concerts. This happens all over the place. It's not just church. So do not think for one moment that I am singling out just the church, because concerts have a similar pattern. So do movies, all sorts of things. Of course, they turn the lights down low. You're lulled in. You're brought in. Video games have the ability to hypnotize. Lots of things. Do it every day. You are hypnotized by things all the time. You don't realize it. You don't recognize it until you can understand the patterns. And even when you do understand the patterns, it still happens. I get hypnotized playing video games. I get hypnotized, listening to music and enjoying. It's a good example is when you're driving, and that calmness of driving, especially if you drive the same route every single day. That calmness and that focus of driving, you basically just fall into a hypnotic state where you have the music going, the car temperature is comfortable. You see nice scenery in front of you, like, those images of nice scenery are usually in front of you. And if, you don't have a lot of traffic like I don't on my route to work, oftentimes I have to try and fight it because I will fall into a hypnotic state and will have to fight myself, not seeing what's actually happening in front of me. The other hypothetical I'm going to leave you with here with armchair philosophy, not every time I'll be doing this is kind of hypothetical questions, but I love anime, and this is part 2 of what I'm talking about, and that's the Shield Hero. And Shield Hero is one of the animes I like the most. I've read 26 books of the Shield Hero light novels. I've read most of the manga, and I have watched the anime, the seasons of anime that are available. And in the topic of the Shield Hero is brought up the slavery. Somewhat ironically, so Naofumi from modern Japan, and he's the main character, the protagonist. He is the Shield Hero. And when he gets to the foreign land, when he gets isekai, basically brought to a different world from Japan, from kind of a Middle Eastern, Mediterranean-style feudal kingdom, the kingdom has prejudice against beast people that are, part beast but also part human. And they make them into slaves most times. And Naofumi is charged with the crime of rape, which he did not do to the female. She basically took all his stuff because the people hated the Shield Hero for reasons. But he's down on his luck, and as a Shield Hero, he can only use his shield for defense. So he ends up buying a slave to fight for him. That slave's name is Ralph Talia. And as it goes on, he buys more and more slaves, or he makes people into slaves. But he does force Ralph Talia to do things against her will. She has what's put on her as a slave crest, basically, that makes them unable to kill, unable to lie, and they have to obey the commands of their master. And if they don't, then their slave crest activates, and they are basically given electric shock. Kind of like a shock collar, but for more things than just yelling. And as I am watching this anime, and I have to ponder the morality in my mind of what Naofumi's doing. Of course, as an American, you would think that he should free her right away. But if he does, like, is she going to fight for him? And she develops what we would call Stockholm syndrome with him. He doesn't really do much things. He does help her. He heals her wounds. He doesn't allow her to get hurt. He protects her in most cases. And the times that he uses the slave crest are in emergency situations where she is scared because of her PTSD, her trauma of being an orphan and having really bad things happen to her, which is part of the anime. As a slave, she has horrible things happen to her. Her friends are beaten and killed, and they are taken slave, and horrible things happen to them in slavery. And because of her PTSD, of course, he utilizes the slave crest to make Raftalia overcome that PTSD. Eventually, she does free herself of the slave crest, although she does get it back after that she is freed by another hero, and they cheat. But it brings up the topic of, is that okay, right? Is it okay to own slaves, period? And so I want to know your thoughts. I want to know your comments. If you want to talk more about Shield Hero, maybe we might do that another time. It's a great anime. It's got a lot of, maybe adult themes in it, so maybe don't watch it with your kids, but it's fun. I like it. I enjoy it. And that's all. So 2 hypotheticals, YouTube. Answer me. Are you a hypnotized slave of the church? And what do you think about the morality of Shield Hero? Would you free the slave or would you not? Leave any answers in the comments below. If I get any, that'd be great. If not, that's cool. And we'll see you next time.